Hello and welcome to the 34th episode of the podcast Historians in Conversation, which is hosted by the University of Lodz in Poland. My name is Michael Green and my guest today is Michael Mascuch, Associate Professor at the University of California in Berkeley, specializing in early modern history. Together we are editing the series Egodocuments and History for Brill, and our conversation today will be revolving around questions of inspiration and career in history, about experiences of Michael in the American academia, tips and advices, and much more. I welcome Michael to my podcast and I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Hello Michael, welcome to my podcast. I'm glad to have you here. And just for the sake of our listeners, I want to say that we know each other for about 2 or 3 years, and we co-edited the series Egodocuments and History at Brill together. So, Michael, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you. It's fun to be here.
It's great talking to you. Finally, not about so much research, but about you as a historian. And I always start with the very same question about childhood. Could you tell me a little bit, and also to our listeners, where do you come from?
I was born in Hackensack, New Jersey in 1961. I have very few memories of that early time, but what I do remember actually is my embodied experience with the built environment and nature, oddly enough. It was kind of a very sensual experience for me, at least as far as I can recall it at this point. I have only snapshot memories of myself kind of like pressing my face against the glass late at night like, for example, on Christmas Eve, just looking at the stars and anticipating the arrival of Santa Claus, which is so ridiculous. But then I also have these weird memories of like my incredible attention to leaves in a pile, raked up leaves in the fall in a pile of, like actually diving into the pile, smelling the smells. I don't know. Strangely enough, for someone who now is a professional historian, I don't really have a larger sense of anything that was going on around me at that time. I kind of relied on my mother and father to take care of that for me, I guess.
Can you tell a little bit about your parents?
Yeah, my mom had been a secretary at an insurance office, and then when I was her firstborn child, I have 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother who are younger than me, obviously. I'm firstborn, and she was a homemaker. And took me basically everywhere she went. And I was sort of, as the oldest child, responsible for taking care of my siblings while she was pushing a shopping cart around the grocery store or whatever. But I think my sensibility really comes from my mother. One of the things we did when I was a kid was go for long walks through the neighborhood, but also out into sort of the outskirts of town. I mean, I grew up in Woodridge, or at least until I was 10 years old, which is a suburb of Manhattan. And that area is often thought of as a concrete jungle, but actually there were these sort of, I guess they're almost like green belts, although they weren't intentional at that time, where we could wander, pick berries, wild berries that were growing in the hedges, just gather things, stones, leaves, take them home and press them, that sort of stuff. My father grew up in Passaic, New Jersey, which was a kind of industrial town. His father had his own grocery store during the Depression, and he overextended his credit to others, and lost his store and went to work for a large supermarket where he was the butcher, and his wife was a checker at the cash register. And my dad had three brothers, and he was the middle. And he was kind of a wise guy. He didn't go to school. I mean, he went to school, but he didn't learn that way. He started working early at a bar. He was underage, but there were no rules about that at the time. He ran numbers, which meant he took bets from people and then distributed them through the bar to the people who ran the operation. And just kind of like he fixed cars on the street. And eventually, just before he got married to my mother, he kind of got himself organized and went to night school and got a job working for a large mining equipment company. And what I learned, I'm reflecting back now on that time with him. I spent a lot of time doing things like fixing cars in the street and repairing machinery in my house with him, which was a bit weird for a kid because he had a temper, let's say, and when things didn't go right, he could get frustrated easily. But now I see that he was not a mathematician per se, but he was a very good field engineer. So I learned kind of to attend to the mechanical world from him. And my mother kind of got me interested in the, I don't know what, the natural world and the world of senses and so forth. So that's my parents on an emotional level, let's say. On a practical level, they just did what they could.
I think it sounds very interesting because growing up in what you call the concrete jungle and then at the same time be able to still have green walks, pick up berries, sounds like pretty normal childhood to me.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's a part of it now that I should say too, because the way you frame it that way, is that my mother's father was also an engineer, worked in Manhattan, and he was an electrical engineer. He was fortunate to always be working through the Depression because everyone needed electricity. And as soon as I don't know, the early 1940s, he bought a dilapidated dairy farm in Vermont, which is about 2 hours north of Manhattan by car. And it was incredibly idyllic. It was a time when the dairy farm industry, which had been there for over a century or two, actually was declining and industrial farms were taking over. So a gentleman engineer could go up there and run his own farm. He had about 700 acres. And I don't know, a herd of cattle. I don't know how many there were, but we spent just about every holiday we could in that place. And that kind of enhanced my natural experience, let's say. Driving up there with a car full of children it seemed like once or twice a month to spend the weekend or longer was itself a crazy experience. I mean, crazy in the sense that it just made all these kinds of impressions on me. Like I remember coming back from Vermont at the end of a weekend, especially in the fall, there would be so many cars with deer that had been shot up there, strapped to their hoods or their backs, the back of the car. It's just like, it's kind of macabre to think of it now, but that was the 1960s, let's say.
Sounds pretty wild.
Very literally in that respect, although it was domesticated in its way too.
How did the boy who was growing up in a concrete block, but then also in nature, having a father who is interested in the mechanics and a mother who is interested in bookkeeping and some, let's say, more mathematical kind of sciences?
Yeah.
What was there for you?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, my father in my life, I think I saw my father read one book. And it was a novel that he picked up at the airport after a flight to, I don't know, South America to look at a piece of equipment in a mine. And it was like I think it was called Coffee, Tea, or Me. And it was one of those, kind of, it wasn't quite Pulp Fiction, but it was more or less that. So not a lot of reading was happening in my house, which is kind of interesting, I think, given that I am like an incredibly avid, obviously, reader now. My grandfather, my mother's father, though, in his farmhouse had a small alcove that was filled with books. He was himself a kind of historian in an amateur way. Was always interested in the history of the local area that he was in Vermont. And I think he inspired in me going up there and spending time not just on his farm, but also sitting in his alcove, kind of inspired in me just a kind of bookish nature. And I guess the other thing is that I just really enjoyed school as an alternative to my family life.
Quite interesting the way that you put it, that school was an alternative to family life. And I mean, I would understand when people tell about their difficult childhood, but that was obviously not your case. So I think it's quite, yeah, different moment. Can you tell me maybe what was so appealing at school? Because it seems like
Um,
your family had it all, like good parents, siblings, so things happening.
the part I didn't say is that I don't know. There was a kind of emotional weather that always it was like just the atmosphere of my house was a little too intense for me emotionally. These things I remember are my siblings say that I have a convenient memory and that I forget all of the awful things.
That's
Um,
really a convenient memory.
Yes, it is. I mean, the only really terrible thing, which is hardly terrible at all, I remember is that our house was in New Jersey, was on top of a kind of a hill. And in the winter time, my dad, for whatever reason, didn't like to put chains on the car, on the tires, to get through the ice and snow. And I remember kind of how awful it was in the car when he would try to, reverse the car slowly to go up the hill in bad weather, and my mother would be screaming at him. But my siblings say that happened. Things like that happened all the time, and I don't remember them. So it turns out that my father was mildly bipolar and hadn't ever taken his medication. And my mother, I don't know what to say about her. She is, or was the kindest, person in the world, but she had her passive aggressive moments. So for me, going to school, first of all, in a social way was just a kind of different experience. And I was, I think, quick to learn. I talked a lot, and my teachers noticed me and took interest in me because I don't know why. I mean, they seemed to enjoy talking with me and encouraged me to read, and I responded well. I don't know. It was an environment where I just kind of found myself and was able to take the best of my family life, let's say, and sort of put it in the classroom.
When did history become part of your life? Was
not
it
until I
already
went
then?
not until I went to graduate school.
Aha,
Um,
good. So
no,
then we
I
will
mean,
get back the later.
yes. Well, I mean, okay, that's kind of in a professional sense where it was very explicit. But one thing about my childhood and history is that I never really quite appreciated some of my habits as being necessarily historical. Um, my mother, for whatever reason, maybe it was because I liked my grandfather's books, my mother always made a point of stopping at church fairs or whatever to go through the secondhand books, stalls. And I just found, I mean, I now see that I have a kind of paper fetish, but I liked older books. And I realized too now that there was a connection not just to the older books, but to that period of New Jersey's history, let's say, during the late 18th century, around the time that the United States was founded. And I used to sort of, in my mind, but then in my life, one of the things I did was play out in that kind of edge of town woodsy area, building colonial forts and pretending I was a Revolutionary War fighter, and sort of acting out in my private way, sometimes with friends, these kinds of historical dramas that I didn't appreciate as such. I mean, it was just like reading the stories of, there was a series of history books from the National Geographic that featured a lot of paintings from the 19th century of that 18th century time. And I sort of found the wardrobes and the dramas, the battle scenes that were painted in this kind of elaborately staged way, with Washington at Monmouth rearing up on his horse to rally the troops. And I don't know. I mean, I without noticing it, I think that kind of visual imagery of history kind of planted itself in me, and I later realized it on a more imaginative level by reading about it in a deep way, rather than just looking at pictures and reading captions of those books.
Did you have the option to choose a specific direction of study already at school?
No, I mean, at least I didn't feel that I had that choice. I might have been nudged there, but I mean, the elementary school system was kind of like a standard curriculum that was spread across, most of it had a kind of social studies, but it was civics, and it was to the extent that, well, these things probably aren't possible anymore, but it was kind of politically minded, educating people about democracy and the electoral process and how legislative action took place and so forth. But it wasn't particular in any way. I think what I was most interested in actually at the time, or I got the most interest from others, was in writing, creative writing, actually. And that's what kind of pushed me through grammar school. I got early involved in the student publications, especially the newspaper. Starting in elementary school, we had a little newsletter at my school, and then in middle school and high school, I was very involved with journalism. I was usually the editor of the school newspaper.
That's quite a job for a young child.
I had, again, I think, it wasn't so much, I mean, it's interesting to reflect on this now. I think those roles, they worked for me. I didn't have trouble doing them, but I am not aware of having actively chosen them. I think it was my teachers who kind of gently guided me into those roles. I remember in what was it, like 5th grade, we had a system in my class where for every math and spelling exam, you would get a star on a chart if you got 100%. And there were 2 people in the class. This is a class of probably 25 students, me and another girl, who were in a race together to get the most stars. And we found out at the Christmas break that the one who was leading in the star chart became the class president. There was no election, in spite of all the civics that we got. The mere fact of having had the most 100s on the test gave you. So I was that guy.
Speaking of democracy.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. It's like kind of ridiculous. I mean, it was, a dictatorship of sorts, I guess. I don't know. But it wasn't explained to us that was how it worked. It was just that when the time came, the teacher, said, okay, Michael Mascuch is now the class president. He has, I don't know, whatever the number was. And it's fine. I was comfortable being, as my mother would say sometimes in her more self-effacing Catholic moments, she would say, I was the great I am. And I was president of the class for having had the most 100s on my test. But it was just, I don't know. I wasn't consciously trying to achieve anything, even academically. I just did what I wanted to do. And it sort of worked out for me, at least at that phase of my education.
And then you had to choose a high school?
So what happened in middle school, so this was when I was 11 years old. I was just starting middle school. my family moved from New Jersey to California. We went from one public school system to another, but California was very different than New Jersey. In some ways, in spite of its sort of reputation as a leader in a lot of civic business, including the education system, I think I was better educated in New Jersey, and was able to accelerate in the California school that I went to, which was in the San Francisco Bay Area. So it wasn't in a kind of, provincial area by California standards anyway. And there again, there was no choice because it was a public school system. There was just one middle school for my town. So we all knew each other fairly well. And again, I was just among the academically head of the class. School newspaper is what focused me. And I played sports as well.
So you were an all-developed child from all possible perspectives, academically, sports-wise.
Yes, at that time. The other thing, though, what killed my sports career, and this happened in high school, was that I have amblyopia, so I have a lazy eye. And it also means that it sort of manifested itself not just as arranging, not being coordinated, but one is farsighted and one is nearsighted. It's fine when you're a youngster playing sports with balls to have that and not have it make a difference. But once we got to high school, the people who were really natural athletes were accelerating. And what was happening to me was that I could keep up with them physically, but my problem with my eyesight made it difficult for me to swing at a baseball, catch a football, which was something that I did. But I was losing track of the balls in the air. And so I was just like not as sharp as I had been or had seemed to be, let's say, when I was younger. So I played sports, mostly ran track and cross country in high school. But the ball sports were challenging for me. I couldn't be at my best, or I had gotten used to a standard of performance that I wasn't able to maintain. So so that part went away, and I became much more invested, I guess, in my my literary and journalistic career, I suppose, at that time.
So when you reached high school,
yeah,
and well, you still lived in Manhattan, I suppose, so you had a lot of choice of where to go to study. How did you make the choice, and how did you choose what you wanted actually to pursue at the university? I mean, was it actually a question if to go to university at all?
No, it was not. I mean, again, that was not discussed in my family. I mean, I think, well, I didn't say it explicitly, but my father went to night school just to get a degree, a credential that because his work required it of him. My mother didn't go to university either. She went to a private secretarial school that gave her a credential that so that she had the skills that was needed to do the work that she did as an administrative assistant. I think it was assumed, however, that I would go. And again, that discussion really didn't happen until high school. And at that point, I was in California, and it was just and I was in the San Francisco Bay Area. And at that time, this is the sort of mid to late 1970s, it was assumed that I would go to the University of California. Not me personally, but everybody in my high school would be learning in anticipation of that path. So, of course, not everyone in my graduating class, and I wish I could even estimate how many students there were. I want to say there were maybe 300 in my class. I really can't have no proportion. I mean, my children went to Berkeley High School, and they were in the thousands in their class. So it's a different system. It's more dense. But we were counseled to prepare ourselves academically for entry into the University of California. And the system here is I guess, liberal in some sense, in that you prepare literally for a liberal arts education, meaning that you are competent across a range of disciplines, and you come to the university and choose what your area of study will be at that time. But for me, in high school, because I was competent, I guess, on my view, in math, and was in an advanced level, but at a certain point, just like with sports, I needed to do things to do well in calculus, trigonometry, whatever, that required me to memorize things and that which I wasn't interested in memorizing. I just did not have the imagination and mindset that would make me a good mathematician. So I stopped as soon as I could. I met the requirements for university, and then I just put all of my energy into journalism and literature because it was interesting and exciting to me, I guess.
And still no history at sight.
No. Well, I mean, there at that point, I guess one of the things that I should make clear is that when I said that in the grammar school, there was some kind of education in what we called civics and social studies that was kind of about the kind of like a primer for beginners in democratic institutions. There was no history about it. The history that I got was really from my grandfather's interest, and my own kind of casual, just finding things interesting and turning. It was like, I think I would say my interest in history at that time was like one of the things I liked to do was wander through the woods and up a creek bed, turning over stones and seeing what was underneath them. I think my interest in history was similar to that. It was me just wandering in a vast space where my curiosity sort of, dictated what I would study next, but only in an amateur way. And that meant that in high school, I had no historical education to speak of, honestly.
So you went to the University of California in Berkeley or somewhere
Yes.
else? In Berkeley.
Yes.
And then you continued as well, we know nowadays, you continued to masters, which was still not in the field of history, but in
English
German,
literature.
English literature.
Yes.
So how did you make the shift from literature to history?
In university, my program in English literature was very stimulating to me, but I was strangely prejudiced against English literature per se and preferred to study American literature. And I think now that I realize it was because actually I was interested in history and I had no real grasp of the historical context of English literature. And oftentimes it was just too remote in time and space for me to study that work. I was much more familiar with and conversant in the context of American literature, if only just from my, my turning over of stones or in my local life. And so in my senior year, I wrote an honors thesis and then a senior thesis. And the honors thesis was on the late novels of Henry James. And the honors thesis was on Milton's Paradise Lost. That was a mandatory. I had to write two theses. I only had to write one. The honors one was optional, but I wanted to write about Henry James, who remains one of my favorite authors. Milton, I didn't know anything about, but I was sort of like, I had, I don't know, limited choices, and I ended up reading Milton, and I was astounded by Paradise Lost. Not so much in his poetics, but in the context of that poem, the political context of it, reading it as an allegory of political life in the mid-17th century in Britain. And I started reading everything I could to learn about the context of Milton's work, and decided in my senior year in college, my fourth year, I definitely at that point, because of my the mentorship and inspiration of some of my professors, wanted to study at the graduate level, but I surprisingly decided that I wanted to know more about the historical context of Paradise Lost. And also I was a bit, I don't know what, turned off by the theory turn in literary studies. Everyone was reading Derrida, and it wasn't that I didn't find that interesting, but I found it a lot of effort for very little payoff as far as I was concerned. And the richness of history beckoned to me. So I thought, but people were saying to me at the time, well, you're not really prepared to enter an American university having studied literature and not history. You would have to start all over again. But if you're interested in British history, you might find a more welcoming institution in one of the Oxford schools. So I applied to Cambridge, and because it was the land of Milton, and I was admitted.
That was quite an achievement.
Well, I mean, they made me. I mean, you know, I was prepared academically with as far as the discipline and so forth. I just didn't have any background whatsoever, and oddly, I was sort of aiming at Milton, but through literary studies, I was really hoping to study with Raymond Williams, who unbeknownst to me, had just retired from Cambridge. That he was still around, but he wasn't supervising and teaching as much as he had in the past. But I did go to his college, where I met an excellent social historian when I got there, which I'll tell you about if you want to know. But I mean, at that point, they made me actually do a 2-year program. So the Tripos is a 3-year program, and but I did an accelerated 3rd year to kind of get me up to the speed of an MA while I was in my first 2 years there. So I didn't become a research student right away. I went and did a 2-year undergraduate program, which was designed, I don't know, not specifically for me, but I was what was called an affiliated student. So sort of on a separate track. And because I knew nothing, and because I was far, far from home when I was there, I read everything that was on the list, which my tutors were saying, wow, this guy, he's the best student ever. Not because I was necessarily better than anybody, but because I had absolutely no idea what I was studying, and I was very diligent about doing the work. And that was a rewarding experience for the tutors, because you know, many home students, they got by it by doing as little as possible, which is understandable.
And then you decided to do a PhD, and the PhD was in
modern history.
Modern history.
Yes.
But
modern history means anything after ancient. So it included, basically it began with the late antiquity, I would say, you know, Middle Ages on to
Middle Ages already as modernity. Well,
I mean, their degree is called modern, but I mean, they definitely break it down into, you know, the typical segments that we used at the time.
Was it a tough decision to shift from literary studies into history proper?
Not for me, but it is interesting in that, because without knowing, because I really was, I mean, I think this metaphor that I came up with of turning over stones and following my curiosity is a good one here. I didn't have an agenda. I started out being interested in what I learned was the 17th century and the English Civil War and so forth. I had no concept of any of that. And that was where I landed, that was where I expressed my most interest. And I got, I bonded in a certain emotional and scholarly way with Keith Wrightson, who is a social historian, Cambridge educated, who had just come to Cambridge after spending some time at Durham, and then also going to Canada for a year. So he had a kind of experience of North America. He had just arrived at Cambridge. I was North American and had just arrived at Cambridge. And he was my tutor for an early modern paper that I wanted to study Milton with, but he was sort of like into microhistory. And I I followed him. I got inspired by his microhistorical interests. But for me, I was less interested in parish registers than I was in diaries and autobiographies that would supplement or contextualize the statistical data that social historians who were still in the thrall of computational historiography at that time, so Peter Laslett and that crew, were very much influential in Cambridge. And I was sort of the odd person studying social history, but from a more, let's say, narrative standpoint, which always made them a little suspicious, because of course, literature, as they thought of it, is not, fact. It's fantasy.
And that brings us to the very important question of what's next. So, towards the end of your study, or maybe already in the middle, you probably had in mind what you plan to do afterwards. And I wonder if you already had some sort of a plan of how to stay in the academia, how to get a job.
Yeah, yeah. I really, again, had no clue. I did not have a sense of the career path of a historian. I was very, sort of short-sighted in that regard. But yes, I mean, I had to contemplate life after my PhD, because I didn't go to, unlike many Americans at that time, this is the mid 1980s, I didn't like plan ahead and apply for and receive a Marshall or other one of the fellowships that might help cover the cost of being so far away. And so I was actually taking out student loans from the United States banks, and I was racking up quite a debt, and I had no idea how I would pay it off. My visa did not allow me to work while I was studying in the UK. So sometimes I went back to the States in summer for a couple of months and worked as a house painter in order to earn some money to pay my fees. So yes, I needed a job. And I realized that I did want to work as an academic because I was interested and I liked doing the writing. I mean, it wasn't just that I read all the books on the list. I wrote the papers too in great detail. So, but again, at that time, I guess in my mind, as much as I enjoyed my Cambridge experience, I could not handle the weather in that place at that time. It's just I'm a wimp. I very much sensually bonded with California, and I felt homesick a lot of the time that I was there, which also made it easy for me to do my work. I mean, I'm realizing that I'm a kind of person who thrives on emotional or physical adversity in a certain way. So like school was good as a counterpart to home, and work was good at Cambridge as a counterpart to not wanting to go outside because it was like 40 degrees and not snowing but raining, and I was miserable in a 300-year-old building that didn't have central heating, nor did it have really good hot water either. So I wanted to go back to the United States, but I had no contacts there academically. If I had been to a US PhD program, I would be professionalized in that particular way by doing graduate student instruction, by going to conferences and networking and so forth. Not having that, being at Cambridge, where I was basically, my life was in the university library in the tea room there, it suddenly dawned on me as I was getting close to finish what the academic career that Cambridge would prepare you for at that time was like, which would be teaching somewhere in the UK, but kind of almost like I mean, this is how I perceived it indirectly at the time, was that the people who were in charge, the people with the professorships already, who were generating the graduate students, had a kind of mental map of where all the jobs were. And there was kind of like a runway for takeoff at an airport where all the jets were in a queue waiting for their turn to be cleared by the control tower to go to the destination. And I didn't see myself, as a lecturer at a British university, biding my time to get a job that would help me pay off that debt. I mean, the system at that time, especially in Oxbridge, was great. I mean, you could have, relatively subsidized, almost totally subsidized housing and so forth. But I was homesick. And I was not going to borrow any money in my, whatever it was at that time, there was my 5th year. So once I was at the writing phase of my dissertation, I went back to the United States. I went back to move in with a woman I was seeing, but not seeing because we were in a distance relationship, and finished my dissertation. And because it was in the San Francisco Bay Area, I went knocking on doors at the University of California, Berkeley, asking anybody who would hire me to teach composition. I wasn't looking for a professorship at that time, or a tenure track job, as we would say here. But once I finished my PhD, and I did have a job as a lecturer teaching composition, it was like a factory job almost. I mean, I had 70 students whose work I was reading on a weekly basis. It was incredible, but I had a lot of energy and I was happy to be back in the Bay Area. So that was kind of what I did. I was working in the department that I teach, that I'm now at as a professor, which is the Department of Rhetoric, somewhere between literature and history. Without me intending it or anticipating it, that became my institutional home.
How did you get the job eventually?
While I was busy making myself useful there, I got to know a number of the faculty, and I was encouraged to apply for a job that became open upon somebody's retirement in, I think, the 2nd year that I was there. And to my incredible surprise, because I was applying for jobs as a historian elsewhere, Texas, places like Texas, large public schools mostly, but because I was just not part of the American system, I don't think I was getting any responses. So I applied for this job at Berkeley, and to my surprise, I was hired.
And then the career continues to the present day. And maybe you could briefly just outline how it developed.
Well, the first thing I had to do was get tenure. So I had 6 years to finish a book, which was going to be, what was required for me to cross that threshold. And I was in a department that was neither history nor literature, working on, I had written a dissertation on social mobility in English autobiography. So what I did my dissertation on was a kind of compromise between me and my supervisor. My supervisor felt that I could somehow solve the problem of how to measure social mobility in the 17th century as a kind of micro-historical project. But I was determined to work with autobiography. And what I ended up doing was proposing a narrative frame for interpreting the experience of people who had changes of career, let's say, sons against fathers was the general way to do it, intergenerational mobility. And reading the what I would now call ego-documentary sources.
Our topic.
Yes, exactly. I felt that the frame that they were using, which was individualized and intergenerational, was inappropriate, because what people were interested in was the sustenance of their family in whatever situation they were in materially, let's say. So coming to rhetoric, nobody was interested in my social historical work. They were interested in me teaching literature in some historical context in order to tease out the rhetorical aspects of it. And so what I began teaching was the idea that storytelling was a form of argumentation. And that seemed to work. But then I had to write a book that sort of like was legible in that way to the people who would want me to stay in the department. So I wrote a book about autobiography and the idea of individualism and self-identity. So I know that's a little technical perhaps for the podcast, but that I made myself into a sort of, as my supervisor at Cambridge called it, a culture vulture, neither a social historian nor a political one, but somewhere kind of floating in between. And that's kind of how I've made my way since, is kind of working on cultural studies more than any, what would be considered more central, hardcore social or political historical work. So, I mean, the kind of people that I might be thinking with there that are known to people who work in, my field now, my broader field now would be like Natalie Zeman Davis. But I wasn't a gender historian in particular. There was nothing fancy about what I was doing in terms of, what was, let's say, a current in historiography of the moment. I found my own way. And since that time, I mean, as we both know, the study of Egodocuments has really kind of accelerated and expanded. That was the 1990s, early 1990s.
And you finally got tenure at what time?
I was hired in 1990 and I got tenure in 1996. I didn't publish my dissertation. I published a couple of chapters of it as articles in social historical journals. And then I set about the business of writing this other book about autobiography itself. And it took me roughly, I don't know, I mean, once I completed the research, it took me probably about a year and a half to write it. I had a generous fellowship at the Huntington Library, as postdoctoral fellowship that was offered by UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles. And so I was in residence there, but mostly commuting out to San Marino, which is where the Huntington is, so a suburb of downtown Los Angeles, far from Santa Monica. But anyway, that's trivia. So in 1997, I was granted tenure, which is a long, long time ago.
And I think that nowadays it would be quite impossible to get tenure track without having a full book published and lots of articles, at least in Europe. I don't know how it is in the United States, but at the same time, we do see sometimes exceptions where people do get a permanent position based on several articles that were published in good places. But I think it's rather the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although, I mean, at the time, I think I had, in getting my job, I obviously had the benefit of being known to the people, to the department in a way that people who are from someplace else and applying sort of on paper didn't have. So people knew my teaching. And people at Berkeley read my dissertation. People in the history department read it and made recommendations for me as a historian based on my PhD alone. And the normal thing to do in the United States would be simply to revise and publish your dissertation as a book. But I felt, and I believe I was right in retrospect, that my dissertation would not get me a job at Berkeley, that I needed to do something different. And I did that. And I had not a book published, but a full book manuscript and several articles in an adjacent field, the social history material, that was sufficient for me to get tenure. But what I think is very important about my experience was that people made a bet on my ability to do something that I hadn't completely demonstrated at that point, that I had good potential, and that if I had the resources, which I'll say at that time at Berkeley, and I think it's still true, junior faculty who are not yet tenured are given a lot of support to complete their work to get to the stage where they can be tenured within 6 years. I mean, you have a ticking time timer on your work. I think that's still true now, but the problem is there are so few jobs and so many PhDs that people, find all kinds of, they do, what we call, I guess, gig teaching work, and they publish things and build up quite a CV of publications before they can find a decent tenure track job nowadays. That I was sort of at the I think the transition point maybe where higher education, at least at the University of California, at my campus, when I got tenure, there were about 1,500 tenure track faculty on the entire campus. It's now 30 some odd years later, and there are still 1,500 faculty there, but the student population has increased almost double. So there are a lot of adjunct and non-tenure track faculty that have entered the university to sort of supplement the tenure track people. And I think that I said even at the time to my friends that I got my job, but I felt that there was a door slamming behind me as I stepped into the room, in the sense that things were changing. I could see that already. I mean, I was young. I was not even 30 at that point, but it felt like we were shifting gears in another and actually turning, we were downshifting and turning in a different direction. But I couldn't see it coming. One of the graduate students I was working with before I had tenure went to do her research in France for a summer, and she needed me to get email. This was like 1994, 1995. I had written my dissertation on a computer in the late 1980s. I used obscure software, Nota Bene, which doesn't exist anymore. So, my career tracks very directly onto the use of, computation in all aspects of university level work. And then the advent of the internet really changed a lot of the way we work, and also, I think, career opportunities for people as well. I mean, it's larger for me, that's just an impression I have, but it feels like somebody needs to talk about that more.
Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation, and I think that our listeners will have a lot of things to reflect upon after this talk. So thank you, and we will put links to publications for anyone who likes to read.
Thank you, Michael.